Well, hello, the moment you've all been waiting for. The slideshow video on how to analyze a Shakespearean sonnet. This will be useful for you as you will be working on a worksheet where I give you a sonnet and you take your best shot at analyzing it. So you'll want to take notes through this, especially on the specific steps. And there's also a little quiz at the end just to make sure that you watch the video. All right, so I like this picture, this rendition of Shakespeare writing, and the reason I like it is because Shakespeare's here with a monkey. Now, we have no evidence that in history Shakespeare wrote with a monkey, but I like the idea. All right, so let's start out with some just basic poetry analysis tips. So we'll get into the specifics on a sonnet in a minute, but let's just talk about some basics. So some stuff to remember. Poetry is flexible. That means that there can be many possible interpretations. Yes, we talk about the correct interpretation, or we talked about the accepted interpretation, but ultimately poetry is subjective. So it is open to your interpretation as well as all the official ones. So make sure you remember that. With this in mind, don't get stuck thinking there's only one right answer. As we just said, poetry is subjective. Something is subjective when it is according to your point of view. So if you're looking at a sonnet and you're like, oh, I don't know what that means, I'm going to look up the official right answer. Challenge yourself to try to at least figure it out on your own first, because your perspective matters. Now, if you come up with an interpretation of a poem, if you can support that interpretation through the text, go for it. Now, if it's not in the text and you're just making some guesses based on your personal opinion only, then it may not be as supported. But if you can support it through looking at the words and phrases in the text, then it can be a plausible interpretation. So I would prefer that you come up with a weird interpretation that you can justify through the text, rather than a widely accepted interpretation that you find from an outside source. So don't just default in looking up stuff on the internet. That's not the best way to learn. That is a way to help you if you get stuck, but you don't want to get lazy. And just to reiterate that, I'm less interested in an official interpretation and more interested in your exploration and thought process. This is how you learn. You're going to learn more by struggling a little than just by looking up. And of course, the poem will also have more meaning to you as an individual. So those are some general things to remember about analyzing poetry. The same goes for sonnets, although they are more structured to form. Now, at the beginning of our unit on poetry, we talked about poetry water skiing, and that's where you read a poem and you sort of skim across the surface of it. You're getting a feel for it. You don't want to jump right into an analysis. You want to read through it a few times first, get a feeling for the rhythm of it, get a feeling for the words. You might even get a first impression on what it's all about, and it might even be accurate. But ask yourself, how does the poem make you feel? What do you see? And after your first reading, on a second reading or third reading, what else do you notice? So please remember to do a bit of poetry water skiing before you get in and beat the poem over the head with a hose, because those first impressions matter. So, poetry water skiing. All right, so a Shakespearean sonnet has a particular structure, and knowing more about this structure can help us analyze the poem. If we know what each part of the sonnet is meant to accomplish in the poem, it'll help us to figure it out better. So once again, since a Shakespearean sonnet has a clear structure, understanding the structure and purpose of each section can help us analyze the poem. Okay, so we're going to be going over some elements of structure that can guide us as we look at sonnets. All right, so in general, a sonnet uses metaphors and images to make an argument, answer a question, or resolve a problem. Now, it might seem weird that a poem makes an argument, but that really is what a sonnet does. You can think of it as kind of a little mini essay where the stanzas or quatrains are like paragraphs, and then that final couplet is your conclusion. So you can kind of think of it as an argument. You can also see it as maybe answering a question or resolving some sort of problem. Now, we also know that Shakespeare's sonnets often deal with themes of love, loss, youth, time, mortality, and death, so we can look for those in the poem. And we can also look for extended metaphors. So an extended metaphor is one that goes on. So it's not just one comparison between something and another thing. This thing goes on and can often go on throughout the poem. My cat is scratching at the door. I'm going to go let her in, and hopefully she won't bother us. If she does, you'll hear that. All right, so let's talk about the first quatrain. So this is where you want to be taking some notes here. Now, that first quatrain of a sonnet establishes the topic or theme of the sonnet. Now, it may not be completely clear, and what's established in that first quatrain may develop as things go along or change. So don't get stuck that that's the problem that we're trying to resolve. That's more like the topic, and it can also give us hints as to the theme. So that's what we're looking at in that first quatrain. The second quatrain establishes a problem or question related to the topic. So the second quatrain is kind of developing from the first. Again, this is a problem or question that gets resolved throughout the sonnet. Now, the third quatrain, there's a lot going on in the third quatrain. In the third quatrain, this is where the sonnet begins to resolve the problem or answer the question, or make that argument more solid. Now, it's important to note that the third quatrain contains what we call a volta. We've talked about that. That is a turn or shift in the mood, emotion, or direction of the poem. This volta is a very important part of a sonnet and really can give you hints as to, oh, that's the direction that the speaker wants to go with this. And usually it's after the volta where we see or in the midst of the volta that the problem starts to be resolved. So we look for that. It's not always easy to find the volta, or sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's obvious, but we do look for it. And then, of course, the final couplet. That's where the sonnet is either summarizing a conclusion of an argument, or it reveals some sort of answer to the question that's been asked throughout the sonnet. What's cool about the final couplet is that it's often surprising or ironic. It often takes a different tone than the rest of the poem. And remember, that difference in tone can be signified by that volta in the third quatrain. So that the final couplet often presents a new take on whatever the problem or question is. So the sonnet's kind of going in one direction. When we get to the third quatrain, it starts to take a little different direction. And then in that final couplet is the gotcha. Oh, and this is where we find the point for the sonnet. Okay, so I'm going to show you guys a suggested process for analyzing a sonnet. Please note that some of these steps overlap a bit. So you might find yourself doing one of these steps while you're doing another. That's totally to be expected. But at least if you do each of these steps, you know that you have done what you can to take a look at the meaning of the sonnet. All right, so the first step, and it might be one of the most important, and that's where you read the sonnet aloud. Step 2 is where you decipher vocabulary. There's going to be some words. There are going to be some words in these sonnets that are kind of weird because how we use words now, it's different from how we use words back in Shakespeare's time. So we're going to have some weird words. The next step is we're going to split up the quatrains. Since we know that each quatrain accomplishes a particular thing, splitting them up and being able to look at them independently as well as how they connect is important. Step 4 is to identify the theme or topic. We're going to be getting hints of this right from the very beginning. We're going to get this right when we read that first quatrain. We're going to start getting a feel for this as we read it aloud, as we decipher the vocabulary, etc. Step 5 is to identify the imagery and other types of figurative language. As we've mentioned, a sonnet contains many metaphors, and often there'll be extended metaphors that start at the beginning and go almost or all the way to the end. So we want to identify that imagery and other types of figurative language because there are underlying meanings, and we can gather more from meaning if we don't take everything literally. Please don't take everything literally in a sonnet. Step 6 is where we identify the question or problem. As you might have guessed, that is starting to happen toward the end of the sonnet. And then we identify the muse, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So who is the inspiration for this poem? And then finally, we can identify the point, which is, oh, that's what the speaker's trying to say. So all of these things, all these steps need to happen. Whether they happen in exactly this order is one thing, but clearly there's a few things you do want to do first. You do want to read it aloud first. You do want to decipher vocabulary first. And then some of these other things can happen while you're doing this stuff. But make sure that you follow each of these steps. On the quiz, there will be reference to the different steps. What's the first step? So you're going to want to take a look at this. Definitely take some notes at this part. Now, we'll be going over each of these steps individually. So if you don't get all of these written down right now, you'll have an opportunity to get them as we go along. All right. So first step is to read it aloud. This goes for any type of poetry, you guys. You want to read it aloud 1, 2, or more. The more you read it aloud, the more you get a feel for it. The more that you'll get a sense for the iambic rhythm. It also can be helpful to mark the accented and unaccented syllables in each line using those really fun diacritical marks. This is also where you're going to be doing some poetry water skiing, getting a feel for it on a surface level, getting a first impression, and maybe when you read it a second time, even getting a second impression. Sometimes just reading it through, you can get the meaning of the poem without beating it over the head with a hose. So very important to read aloud. Now you might be saying, oh, I'm not going to do that. Well, we're in English class, and English is a language, and how the language sounds and being adept at speaking it is part of the English language. So don't skip this part, because if you do, you're kind of skipping some of the essence of what we're learning here. So make sure you read it aloud. If you need to read it aloud quietly to yourself, that's fine. Or if you have an audience who wouldn't mind listening to it, that works as well. Oh, also regarding reading it aloud, this is giving you practice for reading Shakespeare. So make sure you use that as some practice. All right, next. Let's go ahead and do that then. So our first step is to read our poem aloud. So I'll do this first and then you can give a shot. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance, or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Now you're going to do this for yourself. Now again, don't just skip this and say, oh, I'm just going to skip forward. This is an important part of the learning process. It's an important part of understanding how a sonnet sounds and, well, what it means. So if you need to start with a couple of lines, go ahead. Don't worry so much about the rhythm right away. You might get that on a second reading. And take it slow, because some of these words are hard to pronounce if you take it too quickly. So I'm going to give you a moment to do that. If you need to stop the video here, you can, but I'll leave a little bit of time in case you want to try it. All right, so you got to feel for it. You got to feel for some of the rhythms and the rhyming. Notice the different lines that rhyme. Also take note of some of the words that are sort of hard to pronounce. Now, some of these are sort of surprising that they're difficult to pronounce, but some of this has to do with how words are combined. So, for example, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. There are lots of S's and TH sounds that can get mixed up in there. So that would be something maybe to practice a little bit. And summer's lease hath all too short a date. So in that case, really enunciating those words separately so that you can say them without jumbling them up. So the more you read this kind of stuff, the more practice you get, the better you will get at it. All right, so reading aloud. Next thing we do is to decipher vocabulary. As I mentioned, lots of words in Shakespeare's sonnets, well, they're used differently in the sonnet versus how they're used now. So you want to go through some of those words. And even words that you know the meaning of, you might want to double check because they might come across differently. There's the cat being tossed from the desk. They might come across differently in the sonnet in the modern day. So you're going to figure out some of these words. Now this is where it's appropriate to look up some words. You can use the internet, you can use a dictionary, but make sure when you're looking up the words, you're not just looking up the current meaning, but you're also looking up the meaning as it might have been presented in the sonnet. So don't just get stuck in the current meaning. So if you're going to Google the meaning of a word, you might say Shakespeare and then meaning and then the word, something like that. And that'll help you. All right, so let's take a look at our sonnet for words. What are some words here that are challenging? Well, we've got a lot of pretty easy stuff, but we have this use of thee and thou. You'll also see in a lot of Shakespeare sonnets thy. Let's see, we've got temperate. We've got talking about a lease here. We've got these words, they're kind of weird. Dimmed, untrimmed, wondrous, that's kind of weird. So look for the weird stuff. And one, give it a shot just thinking about in context what those words mean. But if you need to, go ahead and look them up. So let's look at some of the general vocabulary. So thee, thou, and thy. These are all different versions of the word you in how Shakespeare was speaking. Now you might think, oh, that's so formal, sounds like the Bible. To some degree, people spoke like this. People in upper classes were speaking different from people in lower classes, but this is how some people were speaking, and certainly how they were writing in formal language. Okay, so thou is you as the subject of the sentence. So thou art as lovely. Thee is used as the object in a sentence. I love thee. Thee is the object. And then thy and thine, this is like your and yours, so this is the possessive. Thy hair, thine, etc. This is like Bible stuff. All right, let's see. Also, what you're going to see in general in Shakespeare's sonnets and Shakespeare in general, that there are going to be verbs that end in est or st. And it's just how things were constructed back in Shakespeare's time. So wanderest is wanders. You can imagine that there's a little e right here. Grossed is grows. Again, imagine a little e. And you're going to see that throughout different sonnets in Shakespeare and other writings of the period. You'll see this in the Bible, especially if you read the King James Version of the Bible. All right, let's take a look at some other vocabulary quickly here. So temperate. Temperate means having a nice temperature or personality. So this is one of those words that kind of can have a double meaning or several meanings. Now, this word lease, we think of a lease as you have a lease on your apartment, and a lease is a time arrangement, and normally a lease will go for 1 year. You can also have leases on cars and properties and other things, but it's a limited time frame. So that's what we need to think of here, that a lease is a limited time frame. So if we're talking about summer's lease, we're talking about, oh, summer only has this limited time frame, and this is saying that it's and it's very short. Now, of course, dimmed is we have lots of contractions in our sonnets, so it's just imagine that it has an ed on the end. Same thing with untrimmed. So if something is dimmed, it's made not as bright. And then untrimmed, we've got that same situation going on. It means untrimmed or not shortened. We also have this same thing going on with oest and grossed. Now, death in the uppercase, that's death personified. Ooh, so that is some figurative language there. We've got wanderest, meaning wanders, and then grossed is grows. All right, so those are just some words. You might find others in here that you don't know. If there are some others, go ahead and look them up, and that way you can get a better idea. Next step is to split up the quatrains. Now we've talked about how Shakespeare's sonnets were written in a very precise poetic form consisting of quatrains and couplets. Now each of those quatrains, each of those sections, quatrain or couplet, it has a purpose. And if you can split them up, then you can say, oh, okay, this is what's going on here, this is what's going on there. You're also going to note that the sonnet will have 14 lines split up into sections. Quatrain 1 is lines 1 through 4. Quatrain 2, lines 5 through 8. Quatrain 3, lines 9 through 12. And of course, the final couplet, the final 2 lines, 13 and 14. So, splitting up the quatrains so you can see what's going on in each one, and you can see where ideas start and stop. It's very helpful to do that. Let's take a look at what that looks like. I've divided up Sonnet 18 into the quatrains. So you see here, the first quatrain, second, third, and the final couplet. So we can look at this more carefully. We can see here that we've got the topic being introduced. Here we have the problem being expressed, and then here it's starting to be solved, and then we see the final resolution here. So dividing up into quatrains and the couplet. All right, step 4 is to identify the theme and or topic. This might be something that you get an initial idea about when you first start reading it, and then you can start getting a better feel as you read through it more. So the first quatrain establishes the topic, gives a hint to the theme, and it's also where the main metaphors and images are introduced. So let's take a look. So we've got our first quatrain, and in taking a look at this, taking a look at the first 4 lines, let's see, what is this about? We know that the speaker wants to compare someone to a summer's day. Let's see, that shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Okay, there's our topic. There's this comparison. We also have some ideas about themes. Not totally clear yet, but we'll get a better feel here. Thou art more lovely and more temperate. So we know at the get-go that the speaker is saying that the person he's comparing a summer's day to is more beautiful and has a better personality. So that's established right away. Then we've got a little something more said about summer. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. Oh, it gets really windy in summertime, and the flowers are affected by the wind. Maybe they even lose their petals. And summer's lease hath all too short a date. So here we've got, well, I'm comparing this person to a summer's day. This person is better than summer, but look, summer's not so great because summer doesn't last. Summer's lease hath all too short a date. So right here we're getting an idea that this is about time, that things go away, that even beautiful things go away. Summer's lease hath all too short a date. So we're getting this idea that there's something about time and how things fade and go away. So, and we see that also happening here in the next quatrain. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. Oh, if you're noticing some metaphors here, you're onto something. So once again, we've got a topic and a theme. The topic really is about this comparison of this person to summer, but the theme seems to be more about how things tend to go away or tend to fade, even beautiful things, even summer. Okay, so we have a feel for our theme here. All right, identify the imagery and other types of figurative language. We've already been doing that, but let's be a little more intentional about it. What makes a sonnet such a beautiful and well-crafted poem is the use of imagery and metaphors. In 14 lines, we see that there are lots of these images that are powerful, and they keep throughout the entire sonnet. So looking at the first quatrain, we can find hints of imagery and metaphors. We've already talked about a few of those. And then also we're going to take a look here at quatrain 2, and that's where that theme is extended. We've got some imagery and powerful metaphors going on. So let's take a look. And then we're also going to go through, we're not going to go through every image in here, but it's something that you may want to do when you're analyzing a sonnet. Highlight images that the author uses. What connects these images? What do they say about the theme? And are they part of an extended metaphor? And the answer is probably yes. And there's a powerful image there for you. All right, so let's take a look. We know that we've got our theme and our topic. We're talking about summer's day, so there's lots of imagery related to summer and warm weather and the outdoors and things that happen during spring and summer. So we've got rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. So this is an image about flowers and springtime. Bad things happen to good or beautiful things. That could be the more literal interpretation of that. Summer's lease. Again, summer has a lease. That's a metaphor. And what we're seeing here is that summer, it goes away. Oh, here we have a nice image. The eye of heaven. The eye of heaven. Sometime too hot, the eye of heaven shines. What is the eye of heaven? Well, it's the sun, of course. And so we have this also referring to the sun, another summertime image or metaphor going on here. Gold complexion, of course, the sun is golden or yellow. Okay, so we've got these images here. We've got more images as we go on, more references to summer, thy eternal summer. We've got wandering in shade, another reference to sun and the lack thereof. We've got this reference to growing, which is also something that happens in spring and summer. So you're going to see these types of images continued. So lots of imagery and metaphors related to summertime, springtime, growing, the sun, things fading, things growing, all of these things happening in the summertime. So we're going to look for these types of images and metaphors. So we see an ongoing or extended metaphor here where summertime and all of the things related to summer are repeated throughout the sonnet. You guys don't know this, but the cat is trying to get onto the computer, so I will hopefully keep that from happening because we're at step 6 and that means we're getting close to being done. All right, so step 6 is to identify the question or problem. So quatrains 2 and 3 develop our topic and theme, often by extending our metaphor. And quatrain 2 is where the question or problem is really established. And then by quatrain 3, we have some hints on how it might be resolved. So let's take a look. All right, so what's the problem? Okay, so first of all, we know we're going to compare someone to a summer's day. We know that this person, the speaker is saying that this person is better than summer. And then we're saying that there are some problems with summer, that bad things happen or there are rough winds that shake the flowers. Summer's too short. It only lasts, 3 months. So we know that's a problem. We also know that sometimes, it's just too hot. Here, often is his gold complexion dimmed. So we're talking about the sun here. Gold complexion, of course, the bright gold complexion of the sun. It gets covered up by what? Maybe clouds or fog. So things aren't always great in the summertime. So here we have some problems, and then we're moving this problem on. And every fair from fair sometime declines. What that means is all good things. All good things. Fair is a good thing. Oh, let's go back. So I click there. A fair is a good thing. Every good thing from its goodness goes away. It declines at some point. Everything, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. So this is the way nature works. We have things that decline after they grow. People, they start out young, they get old. This is just nature's changing course untrimmed. Oh, that's another image there. It's kind of a gardening image. Untrimmed, you can imagine that people might clip the roses. So a couple things going on there. So it's saying everything goes away. Everything. All the good stuff in the world, declines. And this is the way of the world. Chance or nature's changing course and trim. So someone might have an accident, or they might simply grow old, or a tree might grow old, or flowers might fade, if we're going back to our summertime images. Okay, so we've got our problem is that here comparing you to a summer's day, you're better than a summer's day, but look, even summer goes away, and not only summer goes away, everything does. So here we're heading into the third quatrain, and here's where we're going to find that volta. But thy eternal summer shall not fade. What? There's your volta, starting with a but. Now, not every volta is this obvious, but there's a twist here, or a turn. It's a change in mood. Everything goes away. But thy eternal summer shall not fade. Well, how can that be? If everything dies, if everything goes away, how can it be that thy eternal summer shall not fade? So thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. All your good things are not going to go away. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade. Death won't take you. The darkness of death will not be able to take you. We've got this personification where death is bragging about taking someone. What? How can this be? If everything goes away, how could it be that thy eternal summer shall not fade? Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. Ooh, we're getting a hint as to how this is going to be resolved. When in eternal lines to time thou growest. There's lots of different possibilities as to what that means. But this person is not going to, their beauty, everything that's good about them is not going to fade, because they'll be in eternal lines to time thou growest. Eternal lines. What are eternal lines? We need to ask these questions. Are they wrinkles? Are they, you might think of bloodlines. Maybe this has something to do with having children, so that maybe this person will live on by having children. What does that mean? Well, we get a hint from the last line here. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So this tells us what this means. So the question is, what is this? So long lives this, and this gives life to thee. There are lots of different possibilities. One possibility is that this is referring to the poem in general. The poem makes this person live on. So a poem can talk about how wonderful someone is, how beautiful someone is. Now, they're going to die. They're going to go away, but the poem lives on. It lives on. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see the poem. So long lives this, the poem, and this, the poem, gives life to thee. So this poem, if we read it this way, could be more about how wonderful poetry is versus how wonderful the person is. Now the person is wonderful, but they'll die too, unless the poem lets them live on. So we might see this as a love poem, but it might also be saying, you're beautiful, you're wonderful, you're better than summer, but guess what? You're gonna die, just like everybody else. But poetry, and the speaker might be saying, my poetry is what will let you live on forever. This is actually a common theme in Shakespeare's sonnets, so it's probably a pretty good interpretation. So we might see this as a love poem, but it might be more a love poem about poetry versus the person. Now we've already talked about a number of the steps here, and so we'll talk about that. I kind of jumped ahead a little bit, but that's okay. We'll refer back to some of the things I said. All right, identifying the muse. So in Shakespeare's time, it was common for poets to have a muse. This was usually a person, someone that maybe the poem might be to, a source of inspiration, but a person, most often a woman. And so we look back at the poem, we see who is this person talking to. Now, this is easier in Shakespeare's sonnets because the sonnets are split into distinct sections. So the Fair Youth Sonnet, so if it's sonnet 1 through 26, the muse is most likely a young man with whom the speaker has a friendship, or it might possibly be to a rival poet. If it's 127 through 152, it's likely one of the Dark Lady sonnets, and these sonnets are addressed to a woman or mistress who is the object of the speaker's desire. So let's take a look and see here. It could be any of these three, but since the poem seems to be about poetry, it might be, the muse might be a rival poet, or it might even be a young friend. Oh, you think you're so great. You think you're so wonderful. But the only way you're going to stay wonderful is through poetry. Or it could be talking to a rival poet. Yeah, your poems are good, but my poems are better. Now, it's also possible, if we look at this as the muse being the Dark Lady, it's possible, but not likely, since it's been established that this is Sonnet 18, one of the poems that's likely addressed to the fair youth. So this is probably a young man or a rival poet that this is addressed to. So it kind of makes sense. Maybe it's not a love poem. All right, now we've already sort of talked about this. This is step 8. Now we've talked about the volta, that quatrain 3 contains that volta, a switch in mood, and we'll point that out again. That signifies that the sonnet is coming to its conclusion. So let's just take a look at that again. Oh, and then of course the last couplet provides a conclusion or resolution. This is where we find the speaker's main point or conclusion to the argument. So let's just go over that quickly again. So we established our problem. We started resolving the problem here. Really, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. Now, I would say that the volta is here, but thy eternal summer shall not fade. Oh, here we have the problem, but here we are as a hint of the solution. Also, that but really gives a hint. There's kind of a change in tone. It's possible that you could say the volta is here when in eternal line to time thou growest, but it doesn't really have that kind of that feeling of a change. I'd say that volta happens here. And the point, as we've talked about, there are lots of possibilities, but we've talked about how those last two lines really make it seem like, boy, this poem is about poetry, and this is about how poetry can make things last longer, because even someone beautiful, their beauty will go away. Everyone dies. Everyone has bad things happen to them. And it's through poetry that things can stay the same. You guys, I'm sort of laughing because my cat is watching the cursor going up and down on the screen, and she's sitting right here. All right, so we've gone through what it takes to analyze a sonnet. I jumped a little ahead there, but you guys get the picture. I'm going to go back to the steps. So in case you need to write that down, you can see that. So we're going to go back here really quick to the steps. Oh, isn't this fun? All right, so there is our suggested process for analyzing a sonnet. If you need to take a look at these steps once again, go ahead and do that. Yes, these are the steps. You might change up the order a little bit. You might. After you read it aloud, you might be able to answer some of these questions. So some of these things kind of overlap. That's totally fine, but just make sure that you do each of these things when you're looking at a sonnet. Yes, I'm calling them step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, forgot to put step 7 and 8, but those are steps 7 and 8. So now you're going to take a short little quiz just to make sure you listen to the video, and then our next assignment will be getting into analysis. Thank you guys for being so patient, and we'll talk to you soon.